Hey there, welcome to the Ben and Tony podcast. My name is Anthony, and today we have a great guest, Sam Barberie. Sam Barberie is the VP of Sales and Partnerships at Nemedi, a SaaS and SDK medtech startup. Sam was previously the co-founder of Britesiders, a platform building for the next generation of fundraising. Sam was on the founding exec team and VP of Product and Business Development at Superdata Research, which was acquired by Nielsen in 2018. Before his work in technology startups, Sam led large-scale NIH-funded research studies in mental health and psychiatry. Sam's journey has taken him from the world of PhDs in academia and clinical psychology to a scrappy market research startup Superdata to a major corporation Nielsen, and now back in the startup world. Throughout the hustle, he has a unique phrase and life philosophy that I love to hear, something he calls indignant pessimism. In his words, I don't think things are going to work out, but I'll be damned if things don't work out. As he was thrown into roles like sales, business development, and product without any experience, he had to rely on his own wits to accomplish the goals in front of him. When his scrappy startup got acquired by Nielsen and Sam's life changed, he once again had to figure out what to do with what's next in his life. And the entire story is quite a journey that I'm sure you'll enjoy listening to.
You've got to respect the creativity and hustle that Sam draws on when he's trying to make things happen. He literally used his Call of Duty prowess to land a job. And that means he lived my boyhood dream. And it's a good thought starter too. I mean, particularly for anyone who's looking to do something that they don't think they'd be able to get into. What job would you love to get? Now start to think of really creative ways that no one else is trying. The door might open, as it did for Sam. Now, indignant pessimism, which Anthony mentioned, is definitely one thing that I'm going to take from this conversation, and I really hope that Sam's open dialogue on his dealing with insomnia will absolutely, at minimum, provide others in similar positions with courage to get through.
Awesome. Well, we're joined here by Sam, a badass early stage startup exec. You know, you've built companies that have gone on to be the gold standard in the digital games world. You had an exit with Nielsen. So really excited to get into what was that like, and how did you find that process of being merged and acquired by another company? And interesting, your background's in the psychology realm. So, at the very beginning of your story, you decided to bail on the idea of a PhD, presumably in psychology. Would love to learn more about that. Why was that?
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. So, out of school, I went through university kind of with this very linear concept in mind of getting my doctorate and doing research in psychology and also private practice. And I applied to grad school straight out of undergrad, which I knew was an uphill battle. Clinical psych PhDs are perhaps some of the worst in graduate education in terms of acceptance rates and just the rigor to get in. And so most people typically work in research labs after school and then apply. So I applied, didn't get in, it made sense. And the sort of stamp of approval was, all right, go spend 2 years working for a big NIMH funded study. And that's exactly what I did. So I worked for a clinical study of hypochondriasis, like hypochondriacs, people who think that they're sick, which was up at New York State Psychiatric Institute. And it was your typical treatment study, some CBT, some pharmacology, a combination group, and led everything there. Typical study coordinator, patient intake. I did phlebotomy, which was really fun, taking people's blood. Really kind of gamified it. I thought it was like a super fun part of my job. But one of the things that I saw were all these inefficiencies in how the study was run. And academic research is still run, it's very paper heavy. It's very slow. There's a lot of protocols, rightly so, in place for patient safety and privacy. But it means that even innovating in some way, like overhauling our data structure, which was something that I did, isn't necessarily rewarded. Like I was basically free. There's grant money that's going to last a certain period of time. The study's going to take however long it takes. There's not really an incentive to make things go faster or smoother. And so I started to get a little bit disgruntled with that path, but still thought, hey, there's an end game here. This is what I want to do. Went through the hoops for that, applied again to PhD programs, didn't get in again, and then said, all right, screw it. Let's do one more stint, getting a little bit closer to the actual research that I wanted to do. And I started working at a place called the Child Mind Institute, which was a private research lab and a private practice that had just started up in the city and was started by a bunch of my professors from NYU, and worked there for a bit. That was kind of an interesting experience of like almost the taste of startups. This was something that it was super well funded. It was pretty structured in most of what it did, but it was still approached with like, hey, we're growing, this is new. And that was like a nice introduction to what could be. And so once I had been there for about a year, I think I did another round of grad school applications, but ultimately said like, look, this path is just there's no feedback loop here. Like I'm not getting the reward for the effort.
And I guess that's the criticism that a lot of people will say is like the reason that they leave academia. Was that kind of the main reason, or was there other restraints that you were feeling the academic world were having on you?
Well, it's a binary. There reaches this point where there's only so much you can do without a doctorate. And so there was this very clear like go, no go. And when it was no go, it was, okay, I got to do something else. And I wasn't really interested in kind of other paths. Like there are, PhDs in psychology that don't then let you practice, but that seemed really restrictive and wasn't really what I wanted to do. So the idea was, hey, let's transition. And for whatever reason, I think, I interned at some larger companies. Like I just knew that big companies weren't my thing. And there was something about the startup scene and small teams and moving quickly, and particularly feeling like when I do good work, I want to own that. When I mess up, I want to own that. That just isn't something that you can experience when a company is big enough that you can just hide any successes or failures. Mm-hmm. And so I started with just this really like slapdash approach to looking for startups. And I was trying to leverage this really specific experience in running clinical research studies into a totally enterprise-based ecosystem. And it wasn't super easy to do. I mean, I remember, I had done some teaching in the past. I was coming from academia. There were some like ed tech companies that I applied to. There were maybe some more kind of like hard sciences startups. I forget sort of the whole lay of the land, but ultimately
just chucking applications out,
throwing it out there. But actually, like I did a fair degree of kind of more interesting applications. I would make these videos, these like 2 or 3 minute sort of video resumes that were kind of this mini presentation on me and where I thought I fit into the company. Awesome. And
that's a great idea.
The feedback from those were really good. Like people were really interested in them, but it didn't necessarily go into the next step. And I actually remember one application. I think it was like an ed tech company, and they're like, "Oh man, love the video. We want you to make another one." I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? This wasn't even part of your application process.
You're not a videographer.
It's something you liked, and now you just want more of it. Like, there's got to be, a more human.
That's very strange. Yeah.
It was really weird.
What did they want you to cover in the second video?
Like something about, I don't even know, just like how I would approach. I don't know. It was literally just another, like, I don't think they had like an idea in mind. It was just like, let's see what this guy does next. And then the rejection was great too, because it was like, hey, Sam, it was great talking about the company, but, we feel like you're not a good fit or whatever. It's like, we never spoke. So, just like that formulaic, like,
Yeah.
And what were you feeling at the time? Because you're kind of talking like nonchalantly, going through these different applications and stuff. But this was like a big change for you, right? That transition, was it tough? Did you feel like, oh, whatever, it's not a big deal, or did you kind of question like what you were doing? Like, was it an easy thing to go through or a harder thing?
I have always been super pessimistic, but I had this style of pessimism that I call indignant pessimism, where it's like, I don't think things are going to work out, but I'll be damned if I'm going to let them not work out.
I love
And
that.
that kind of ultimately became my sales style too. But so in this particular process, especially with something like that, where it's like, okay, whoever I just sent this video to, like, I'm top 1%. Like, no one, I might not have the experience that they want, but no one has sent this video. And so for them to be like, nah, we don't really see it. And he's probably some like, other 23-year-old who has no idea what he's doing. It's like, all right, I'm not really buying how this process is going.
Mm-hmm.
But it was just sort of like a rinse and repeat. Like, it was sort of a formula that was working. And
So you're building some
so
resilience for rejection at this stage already.
plenty of rejections, but yeah, you kind of build up this shell of like, whatever, like that just wasn't going to be the thing. And like that response, like if this isn't sort of stroking some kind of interest, then this probably isn't going to work down the road either. uh and so I was like looking at my background, I was looking at things that I was passionate in. Like, I was trying to give myself some sort of direction, just to narrow the search in some way, and ultimately found this listing for a like a market analyst position at a market research company. And I said, look, I know research, I can do SPSS, I can do stats. And it was in video games. And I'm like, I'm a gamer. I feel like I can merge these worlds. And so I applied. I think it was through the NYU career website, actually. And so I threw in my application, but then I didn't make a video for them, but I started to do like a little bit of sleuthing and figured out where their office was. And so one day after work, I took my CV and a cover letter and then screenshots of my high scores on Call of Duty, which were like pretty solid. Like, I would go like 44-0 in a given round. And I threw them in an envelope. And I went to this like very sad co-working space on 23rd Street. I'd never been in a co-working space. So I had like no idea what I was walking into. I thought I was walking into like the office for the whole company. I was like, this is really sad. And I said, hey, I've got an application. I want to give it to the CEO. And so she calls the CEO, Yost, to the reception desk. And I said, hey, I'm applying for the market research job. Like, he was taken aback. He's probably never had a visitor to this office in the history of the company. And
Let alone one with this kind of COD score.
right, yeah. And so I like hand him the thing, and he's like, oh, cool, I'll take a look at it. And like, that was it. It was like, he's going to go finish his workday and I'm going to walk home. And I'm halfway down the block and I get a phone call, and it's Yost. And he says, hey, can you come back right now for an interview? And I was like, sure, let's do this. And so I go up, and the whole company was just him and Janelle, his co-founder, who is also his wife. And we just kind of like launched into this relatively casual interview of like my background, what they were looking for. I don't even remember what everything that happened. But it seemed like it went well, so I left. And then wanted to give things like a day or two. I forget what they said in terms of their timeline and everything else. I was like, all right, let's do a little bit more. Like, I think I was looking at their blog, and I wanted to write a sort of research article on something in the game space to show, hey, I have a sense of what's going on here. So I wrote this like analysis of Xbox versus PlayStation and like hardware sales. I forget exactly what it was. And like their office was literally on the way home. So it was just super convenient for me to stop by. So I was like, all right, I'm going to bring this up to them too. So I get there and they're
They
actually,
hadn't asked for any of this. You're just doing this because
no,
it's
of course
creative.
not. Yeah. They weren't like, oh, hey, we love the first thing. Keep going. Show us more, high scores. Like this
Just
was
another video. Yeah.
yeah, a little bit of a different approach. Uh, the two of them, Yost and Janelle, they're standing outside the office because it's the end of the workday, and they're there with this other guy, and it turns out he was the head of the board for Superdata. And I said, "Oh, hey, I did this extra analysis. Like, here you go," and I just walked away. Um, and apparently, what John, who was the head of the board, said, either you guys hire that guy as your biz dev guy, or I will. And
Love that.
that's ultimately what happened. Yost gave me a call one day, and he said, "Look, we don't think you're right for the market research position," which he was totally right about. It was much more like, data piping experience and SPSS or whatever, just like big data stuff that I hadn't had experience with. So it was good that I didn't get it. It was like, what do you think about starting in biz dev at the end of the summer? It was like a couple months away. I was like, sure. And ultimately started, they were two people. They were essentially a consultancy. It was barely a business yet, but they knew they had the inklings of something and they wanted to take it to the next step. But they had no formal biz dev structure. They had no marketing. They barely had kind of any syndicated products. And so, we were both kind of taking this shot in the dark. And what I started doing was going there after my day job and sitting with Yost and just kind of talking shop, like trying to ramp up on an industry where I was a consumer, but certainly knew nothing about it from a business perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And just get a sense of like, all right, how are we going to do this? And it got to the point where there was just, this time where it made sense to flip the switch. Like, hey, there's something here. We're kind of moving in a certain direction. And I remember kind of, negotiating that they wanted a full commission structure. And I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. So I'm not going to survive based on like only eating what I kill. I was like, look, just cover it so I can continue to exist in New York City, and everything else will be upside. So if I'm successful, we're all successful. And that was it. I started working there, and again, the pessimism crept back in pretty quickly. Like, we knew no one. I got nothing but 0 emails back at best. And it was really just trying to figure out, like, how do I reach people at like mega companies like EA and Activision and Tencent without any sense of what I'm doing, without any products to really sell them, and certainly not knowing how to navigate anything in that world.
But you'll be damned if you don't make it happen.
But I'll be damned if I let it not happen.
I feel
And
that was a cliffhanger. I'm so excited to like know the solution now.
Yeah. How do you
Yeah.
find this?
Yeah, definitely. There's definitely a silver bullet. Don't worry. No, it was like, how do we take this beginnings of a company and actually make it like a real startup? And it was, picking apart everything that they had been doing, but trying to figure out, like, what do companies actually do? I was like, okay, they sort of had a blog, but there wasn't really any marketing. So I started writing blog posts, and I started trying to handle all of our PR. There weren't like any sort of set menus of offerings. So I started making those. And then that kind of evolved long-term into me owning product development, because there was just this back and forth of like, if I did start to talk to someone, but I didn't have a product for them, well, how do I create that? And so just sort of that constant back and forth of business development and product development, and how they kind of interact with each other. And then just getting more and more ramped up on an industry that I didn't really know anything about. It was like way bigger than I expected. There were way more players, and there was this whole kind of halo of people who were involved in the industry, but not necessarily the game publishers whose names I knew, like hedge funds that invested in all of them. And each one of those moments was this like total rebirth of figuring out like, who are these people, what I want, how do I help them, and trying to figure out how to do that while we were growing entirely organically, and had almost no idea as a collective of what we were doing. So it was a wild ride.
Yeah, that is a wild ride. And I mean, you're basically, in some ways, kind of just moving around blindly in the dark, trying to figure it out, trying to figure out who's important. How did you start to figure out, okay, this is the person that I'm going to go through to find my market, or this is the kind of person that I really need to be getting feedback off to make this the product it needs to be?
The reality is that I feel like I never came up with a real playbook. And I think that this was an experience not only of what B2B sales looks like in certain industries that have so many different stakeholders, but particularly when those stakeholders aren't necessarily identical in even how they run their own businesses. And so, I'll take EA and Activision as two examples where these are both, large public American game companies. They make games that are almost identical, that they launch at, the same time of year. You would think that the person I talked to at Activision would be the same kind of person that I would talk to at EA. And that just wasn't the case. How they sort of centralized business intelligence and insights was totally different. The kinds of people that I would talk to, but even just the approach culturally in one company, some people said, hey, I'm the junior market research analyst, but this stuff is going to revolutionize my day-to-day work, and they help you get up the food chain. Whereas others, like it's, working with an exec and then trying to make a decision happen at that level. Even when I started hiring for my sales team and client relations team, what I looked for were people who were really flexible in how they approached conversations, because I couldn't say, okay, you need the director of business intelligence and you sign that email and then you do it again and again and again. And so instead it was like, I can only help you so much. I'm going to give you, as many arrows in your quiver as I possibly can, but these need to be like nimble, smart people, so that if one email doesn't get returned, they've got 10 more ready to go, and they just keep going.
And what happened next? Was there like an inflection point where you feel like it started off that there was quite a big mountain to climb? Was there like a turning point for you in terms of that company and what ended up happening next for you and the company in general?
It's funny. I think that there probably was, but from my perspective, it was always just raising the bar. Like if I, as I closed like increasingly bigger and bigger deals, it was never like, there might've been this 2-second, like, holy shit, we did it moment. And I was like, okay, what's next?
Yeah.
How do I make it bigger? How do I do more? And that just kept going. So it wasn't like, oh man, we flipped this switch and now, everything's just flowing in a crazy way, because it just doesn't really happen with a company that's, so B2B, so sort of hand holding. But I think there was this moment where we primarily sold Excel spreadsheets. Like that was the main product, Excel spreadsheets and PDF decks. And it wasn't super sexy getting on a call and doing a demo of an Excel spreadsheet. Like I tried to do it, and I'd like graph it and be like, look at this number and look at that number and how cool is that? But it didn't mean anything, like even if I told a story around it. And so eventually I said, guys, we need a dashboard. Like there's got to be something to make this a little bit easier to distribute and a little bit more visual and easier on all of us. And we started building a dashboard. And I think that was the moment where we went from, this consultancy that sold numbers to a company that had scalable products. And that was definitely exciting, because from a product perspective, it was so much more to work with, but from a sales perspective, everything got so much more tangible. I had this thing that I could really work on, that I could really put in front of people, that had a name, is the Super Data Arcade. Like, this is where all the stuff about games goes. And that, ultimately, I mean, it became a household name in the industry, and that was really exciting.
That's awesome. This is like, I mean, the words, I mean, you said indignant pessimism, but the House of Card, ruthless pragmatism comes to mind. You were just pragmatic the whole way, with who you spoke to, how you approached the product, what you needed to build, and you just got it done. So, at that stage, you went through an exit though. You hit the big time. Like, what was that like, and how did that happen in your company?
I will say that uh, for all my moments of pessimism, I mean, it was really like having strong leaders in Yost and Janelle that made those dark moments not so dark. If it weren't for them saying, sometimes even just blindly, like whether they had conviction about it themselves or not, they're just like, no, it's going to be fine. Go do it. I don't know that we would have, of course, done what we had done, but we grew this business. I was leading a bunch of different teams, started kind of parsing out different things where I didn't have expertise. Like, I'm not great at PR, so we kind of had folks handle more of that. We spun up a quality assurance team and a client relations team and all these things, and it really looked like a full-blown business. And we had always been having conversations with larger market research companies who knew that we were doing something innovative. None of them covered digital games. They all covered kind of the traditional, go to GameStop, buy your Call of Duty, go home, put it in your PlayStation, play it. That's all they knew. One unit, $60, beginning and end of their insights. And digital was just so much more complicated, but also the growing side of the market, whereas retail was just declining and declining and declining. So there were always people kind of sniffing around like, hey, what's Super Data doing? What's happening? And, there were some sort of false starts where we thought like, why don't we partner on some stuff, or why don't we get certain things off the ground? But these were just big companies and they could only move so quickly. And so I think it was like right before I was about to go to the conference in SF, where the five of us, we called ourselves the SD5. It was kind of like, co-founders and the core leadership team, sat down and was like, hey,
It wasn't a cult. It wasn't a cult.
Wasn't a cult.
That's
it was
superhero
really,
sounds like.
yeah, it was a little bit more like A-team sort of, but really family. Like, we were super close. And it was like, hey, we're having conversations with Nielsen. It's going in a certain direction. And like, that was kind of where we left it. Like, I had to go hustle on the West Coast, and I was super distracted the whole time, but that's basically what I wanted to focus on. And I forget how long it took ultimately, like however many months from that sort of initial, like, this is probably going to happen, to actually happening. Talking to more leadership at Nielsen. We had already kind of known the games team there a little bit and had hung out with them at shows and stuff.
Was this something you had in mind as well? Like, were you speaking to them with the idea at the back of your head, okay, we could sell to Nielsen pretty soon? Or was it just natural that you're in the same kind of space and you're just talking?
So of all the potential suitors, I would say I had always been most interested in Nielsen because I thought they were the best complement to what we did. Kind of this combination of data and consumer insights. And as gaming became more about not just like a retail purchase, but an actual media ecosystem with esports and gaming video content and streaming and everything else, it just made sense that the household name in media would be the place that we would wind up. So I think it was always pretty transparent about where we wanted to go, but not necessarily sure like who's going to sort of pony up and have the best offer and the best home for us to live in. And so when things finally got solidified and hey, we're really joining Nielsen. It was a super interesting experience, both in terms of telling the rest of the company. We're about 35 people at that point. A lot of them had no idea what acquisition meant. I mean, some of them had been there maybe a week by the time we told them, like, hey, you don't work where you think you work anymore. And, you know, for me too, like I was just wrapping my head around what this meant in every sense, and kind of weighing the fact that I know I don't like big companies with what I thought were the opportunities for super data and all of us, and everything that we could get accomplished there. And it was a really weird and sort of ultimately unfortunate transition into Nielsen. And I think that this is like sort of a cautionary tale to some extent, but also maybe par for the course with a lot of people's experience, having talked to other people since. But the whole M&A team that we worked with as part of the acquisition left within weeks of us kind of closing the deal. And a lot of it was just them sort of seeing the writing on the wall. They knew there wasn't going to be many more acquisitions in the near future. And so they all bailed. And so there was this great divide between what our sort of acquisition terms and operating a plan looked like, hey, here's what you guys actually need to do in order to make this worth it to us. With everything that had been sort of a soft conversation about what was promised to, you know, our team in terms of adjusting their compensation, in terms of hiring plans, in terms of introducing us to people with, you know, data. Like we wanted data. We were so hungry for just more data because we're like, man, we, you know, look at what we've done with how much we've had. Imagine if we had more. And for me, both in terms of product and sales, that was a big letdown, you know, to kind of get there and think like, okay, we're not really going to be shepherded through any part of this transition. And Nielsen's a company of, at the time, like 44,000 people. Like, how do I even find the right person to get things to the next step? And then on top of that, it's a pretty siloed and territorial place. And so, you know, this great sort of collaborative relationship that we thought we would have with all these different teams wasn't necessarily the case. And so I think it was, you know, for most of the team, it was day to day, they kind of continued doing exactly what they were doing. For those of us who had been really excited about where we could take things and had gotten glimpses of those conversations, I think it was really disheartening, where our effort was spent not on, you know, ingesting and making sense and productizing all, you know, millions of new data sets that we never thought we could get our hands on, and instead became, I need to adjust my team's compensation so that they feel happy and stay. And it was just a horrible use of our time. And so, you know, I think a couple things happened at that point. One, I developed really bad insomnia. I've always been a super anxious person, and it's found different conduits throughout my life. And I'd say indignant pessimism is a big part of that. But for whatever reason, during this kind of transition time, it decided to focus on sleep and like getting hype, you know, sort of meta anxious about the idea of sleep and not sleeping enough and losing sleep and everything else. And there was, you know, a full 2 weeks where maybe I got a couple hours here or there. Wow. Like really, really dark days. And, you know, I didn't really have much of an escape. It wasn't like, oh man, I'm super tired, but I'm super excited about everything that I'm doing at work. Like there's nothing but up and up. And there was a good degree of trial and error. Like, you know, I what started therapy, which I was weirdly reluctant to do given my experience, but maybe also not that weirdly, because I felt that, you know, it was a little too close to home. Like I had worked in psychiatric research. I had run studies on cognitive behavioral therapy. And I was like, okay, I'm going to go see a person who's doing all the techniques that I worked with people to deploy on others.
Mhm.
And it just
And also,
didn't
I think there's
work.
something in knowing the technique as well. Does that actually kind of limit its effectiveness on you?
It definitely was. I think I had seen behind the curtain a little bit too much. And so knowing like, okay, this is why I'm doing this. Like for someone who's an overthinker, that's the worst case scenario because now I'm overthinking what it is that's supposed to make me stop overthinking. And I'm just going to spiral from there. And so, there was a couple months where I started doing CBT. I started doing meditation, which I think ultimately was great, but it's sort of like one tool in the toolkit. It wasn't, the magic bullet. And then, um, ultimately started doing a different kind of therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy, which I was really also hesitant to do. I'd had less experience with it. It's sort of like an offshoot of CBT, but focuses more on the idea of accepting. And I didn't want to accept. I didn't want to accept that I wasn't sleeping, and that, so it was this very counterintuitive thing that ultimately really worked. And so as that challenge started to abate a little bit, the focus shifted from, okay, Nielsen is a short-term stay. What do I want to do next? And I had no real answer to that. Like I had all this experience in a particular industry. But at the same time, felt like I didn't have any obvious signals from that where it's like, oh man, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, or I'm going to go work for one of the companies that I've sold to in the past. Like that sort of what I feel like sort of traditional trajectory just didn't appeal, especially just jumping from one big company to another.
Yeah,
Um,
just a question as well, Sam. You were having a pretty negative experience when the kind of the glamour of what it could have been, wore off. Was this something that the rest of your team was experiencing as well? Like, what was the day-to-day experience of members who had just joined Nielsen, and were they still kind of in with the hype of it, or had they kind of, signed out a little bit themselves?
you know, I think for people that had had a little bit more of a well-defined job, it wasn't that big of an issue. Like there were certainly kind of the typical bureaucratic stuff that comes with a big company, but I think most of them were totally happy, or just as happy doing what they had been doing before. And obviously, people that we hired while at Nielsen didn't know a different life, and so for them,
Yeah.
it was all kind of the same. But I think for the SD5, it was this uh, constant source of frustration and gossip, and something that if we had been able to budge anything would have been really motivating, but like every time we tried to do something, just getting a brick wall, whether it was from other teams or again just the bureaucracy, like we just ran into dead ends.
Yeah, I'm trying to get a sense as well. Like, is this an experience that's typical of an acquired company going into a big company? If you had conversations with, you mentioned you had a few conversations with other folks about their experience, if they kind of seen it the same way?
I have a friend who sold his company. They were probably like 800 to 1,000 people, and they sold it to a massive company for hundreds of millions. And so the scale was totally different. But it was funny when we would talk, the magnitude of our issues were totally different, but the actual issues themselves were relatively similar. Like he talked about literally tracking down some exec knowing that he was in a conference in New York because he thought this guy might have money for comp adjustments for his team, and his team was bigger than my entire company. And so it was like the same flavor of issue,
Yeah.
but relatively different. And that said, I mean, I haven't had too many conversations around it, but I have yet to find someone where they say like, oh, it was just nothing but magical. Like, everything that we talked about beforehand went exactly as we planned. And maybe that just is how it goes. And, we kind of didn't know how to steel ourselves against that enough. But when you're in the middle of it and kind of, and you are such a small team and wanting to do right by that team, not just in terms of their livelihoods, but things that they're excited to work on, I think it felt that much more personal.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And I guess, for any company that's got a real vision for where they want the future to be going, if you're acquired, that then has to kind of meld with a company who's probably got a completely opposite vision to where they want to go.
It was this idea of, Nielsen said, we want to become more like you. And it could certainly be that they meant that they wanted to innovate and move faster and, capture kind of new verticals and evolving digital media. But they have yet to put their money where their mouth is. I think they just announced that they're going to have like streaming video data in 2024. Meanwhile, Netflix has been around since what, 2008? I don't remember.
I feel like I have when I hear stuff like that, like a big company wanting to like imitate a smaller company's like a startup-y innovation vibe, I just have a lot of cynicism when it comes to that. I spent like in my career, I worked with a lot of big companies, like a lot of CPG companies like P&G, Unilever, and seeing them acquire small brands. Sometimes it works out, but generally speaking, it doesn't. And I just think maybe it's like a natural sort of creative destruction that will happen. But and Nielsen, I don't think of as like, I mean, I have a couple friends that work there. It's good people, I'm sure, but I don't think of it as like a super sexy place I'd bet on, to be honest.
Yeah.
Most of the people there that, especially higher up, like they're lifers. I mean, this is like the only company that they've known for most of their career. And so, showing up and saying, hey, we're the new kids on the block and we want to change everything about what you do. Like, even if there's some sort of higher level, wish that would be the direction the company would move in, it's hard to have that, distributed of a network kind of get its act together. And it is different from, something where, something like on the CPG side where it's like, okay, at least on the logistics side, like we've totally, gotten rid of a bunch of things and just gotten more efficient. Like we didn't really have those efficiency problems. And so everything that we wanted was about being hungry for the next step in our innovation, and not being able to do that, I think was just, a bummer. I mean, I was there for about a year and a half. I don't think we launched a single new product during that time. Like it was just rinse and repeat. And that was definitely the time where I was like, okay, time to move on to the next thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, it sounded like the bummer you were feeling at work also translated into the insomnia that you were suffering as well. And it sounds like you found a solution with like the acceptance therapy and stuff. Like, what was your professional solution to your professional problem from like a career perspective at that point? Once you'd kind of spent that year at Nielsen, what was the feeling about what happens next?
It was definitely this perfect storm, right? Because I would go through the day and it was just very unfulfilling. Like there was no kind of, my whole life had been about this kind of very linear path, and like the unknown is the most terrifying thing to an anxious, overthinking mind. And so, I went from school where it's like, okay, I'm going to get my doctorate and I'm going to practice, and like this is what's going to happen. And I had mapped out this period of time. Funnily, switching to super data, it was, I didn't necessarily know what was next, but I knew that I was just going to keep doing it. Like, okay, I'm seeing this company through, like we're going on to the next thing, whatever it is. And so when you hit this kind of threshold of there is no next thing, it's just more of the same, it became, I think, ultimately with hindsight, like totally terrifying, because I had no idea what I wanted to do. And so, I knew, look, I'd worked with incredible people. My coworker, John Carlo, he was the first guy I hired for my biz dev team. We had kind of grown together in Superdata for about 5 years. We were friends. We sort of started talking like, this is something, there's something here. Like we want to do something together. And we took a trip to upstate New York and kind of like holed ourselves away in a cabin for a couple of days and started brainstorming, like, what do we know? What are we good about? What opportunities do we see? And it was really just kind of like an open-ended set of questions, and really nothing came out of that weekend that we ultimately did. Although I think we came up with some good ideas, and we certainly went on a really nice hike. But where we ended up was actually this kind of like fever dream that John Carlo had one night that was born out of experience in what we covered at Superdata in gaming video content. Like streaming's just gotten bigger and bigger and bigger. And a lot of people have started to use their streams to raise money for causes that they care about. And like Twitch alone, people on Twitch have, raised tens of millions of dollars a year for different causes. And like, that's awesome, but it's a really disjointed experience for the consumer. And it's also just kind of bundled up in the niche world of gaming video content. And we said, all right, can we make a platform that leverages that kind of live stream charity fundraiser, breaks it out of gaming, and is a tool that anyone can use? And so we started kind of tinkering with this idea, and it had a bunch of different versions of it over the couple months that we thought about it, and reached a point where we said, okay, end of the year is going to come up. We're going to leave in January and start this thing, whatever it is. And that's what we did. We started Britesiders, and the original idea was working with content creators to leverage their audience and raise money for charities that they cared about. We built a whole platform to do that. We were coming from games, and so we really wanted to gamify it. We thought, what are kind of the hooks or the mechanics that we can enable so that it's not just this like simple donate button. One of the things that we launched was this idea of voting. So, hey, maybe I'm a musician, I'm doing a live charity concert. You guys are my audience. You get to vote on my next song, but you're voting with dollars, and the dollars are really cool. For a good cause.
That's really cool. Yeah. Is it sort of for profit, presumably?
We were a for-profit. We were raising for nonprofits. And, that was kind of the first sort of headache, was wrapping ourselves around a regulated space where we were coming from a non-regulated space, and everything that goes into being, we were called a registered professional fundraiser, like legally designated to solicit donations. There's a whole can of worms there because every state does it differently. There are municipalities that handle charity fundraising differently. Nothing has been innovated for digital fundraising or crowdfunding. Like, just none of these laws have been updated. And so, there was kind of that side of it. Like, what's the most efficient way for us to tackle this without hiring a legal team to, look into every 50 states rules? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, trying to build, a tech company and work with content creators and musicians and performers. And there was a lot of different things going on.
And so what happened with it? I mean, were you able to pick it up? Like, are you still going with it? Is this still in progress?
Yeah. So, we built this platform. We worked with neither of us is technical. So we were working with a dev shop, and, we built this thing and started hosting fundraisers, and the fundraisers were super successful. I mean, we had the opportunity to do some A/B testing where we were taking people who had done, let's say, fundraisers on Twitch using the existing infrastructure, and we said, okay, do it with us. And we were raising, 300% more. So like, that's incredible. We're making more money for good causes. The challenge that we had was, again, trying to relearn a whole new industry. And this was essentially media. We wanted access to notable names, people with followings that they could then work, to bring in for an event. And it was this double whammy issue of not only not having an in that world, but also even when we did get conversations, a relatively large creative lift to say, okay, maybe you don't live stream, but you're going to live stream with us and you're going to raise money for charity. Or maybe you are used to live streaming, but you're going to kind of reconfigure things and it's all going to be about fundraising. And there's just a lot for people to kind of understand. And so, we did a number of events. We started, the pandemic hit, we started working with charities who were trying to figure out like how do they shift all of their galas and in-person fundraising online.
Almost
We had
brilliant timing,
revenue.
man. Yeah.
Yeah, it was interesting timing. I mean, it was something where I think that there was only upside. At the same time, the space started getting super crowded because everyone was doing live or digital fundraising or galas and trying to figure out what that looked like. And I think the revenue that we had, the traction we had was really promising, but it wasn't, I don't think it was really scalable. And so, but everything that we saw was that the traditional crowdfunding platforms are starting to fail, particularly younger audiences who wanted to take more control of their fundraising. They wanted to make it more personalized. And we ultimately decided that we wanted to make the GoFundMe for Gen Z. Something kind of lightweight, mobile, something that doesn't have just this kind of like boomer aura essentially. And it came out of everything that we saw with, fundraising during the pandemic, fundraising during BLM, where people want to really, tout their fundraising, which is totally different than previous generations, where it's like you might give to a couple individual charities, not a cause, you give to a charity with a specific name, and you don't tell anyone about it, and you see everyone at the gala party in November, and that's pretty much it. And I think things are moving in a new direction, but what we ultimately decided was we were an incomplete team. We had no CTO. We had some conversations that we hoped were kind of edging in that direction, but didn't ultimately pan out. And this sort of pivot, even though we had so much infrastructure and so much kind of going for us already, I think was relatively intimidating to tackle without a CTO. And particularly even if we got all the funding that we wanted, just being on the other side of it and still handling things the way we had been, where it's like us working as non-technical people with a technical team located 7 time zones away.
Yeah.
And so we ultimately decided, look, there's something here. It was a weird decision because I only got more excited as we thought about it, even though we were kind of edging closer to deciding to shelve things. And that was a weird place for me to be, again, in terms of pessimism, to like suddenly be like, oh, no, there's something really cool here. But I think, we made the decision like about a month or so ago to say, this is something worth revisiting, but not something that we want to handle right now. And yeah, that's where we wound up.
So what's on what's the plan for 2021 then? Figuring this out, or do you have specific plans? And we're recording this in December. I think it's a very reflective time for everyone as we look into the next year, both because of the pandemic, but just like the time of year it is. Like, what are you thinking for 2021 now?
It's been this opportunity to kind of try to actually give myself time that is, for me, counterintuitive. Coming from that, I always need to have a plan, I always need to have a next step, to say, no, I can actually take time to really think about what I want to do next. And in a weird way, it's almost like going back to that transition from academia into startups where it's like, okay, I'm taking something, I don't quite know what it is, but I want to turn it into something else, and trying to give myself some sort of direction for doing that. And, I've since college always had this passion around where technology can be used in research and treatment in mental health. And there's been an explosion of that over the past couple of years, and especially over the last year. Um, so it's been some of eyeing what's happening there, talking to companies that are doing cool things in the space, um, consulting and advising a few startups that are in mental health and healthcare, and really just trying to get like a lay of the land and think about, what do I do next and where can I be most helpful for people. And it's been interesting to kind of take that moment to pause and think about it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, you're a driving force when you get started, right? So that's probably the reason. So who would you love to reach out to as a result of this? What's your like ask if someone's listening to this, who they ideally be and how can they get in touch?
you know i I feel like I'm in such a stage of just being hungry for information and conversations about what people are doing and thinking about. And so, whether that's folks who are trying to tackle big data or market research or consumer insights in a new way, I love having those conversations. I feel like I, sat at the nexus of a lot of different things in that world, and
Mhm.
maybe I can be helpful, but also it's always interesting to sort of see who's pushing the envelope in that. Um, but especially people who are looking at market research, or sorry, mental health, and um, doing something truly innovative. I mean, I think there's a lot of telepsychiatry going on. Some of it is better than others, and this is where I have a hard time kind of taking off my like statistical significance, high threshold for efficacy hat from my background, and saying like, okay, no, these are real things that can help people. Um, but keenly interested in companies that are doing something truly new, whether it's in medical devices or measurement, or something in the telehealth world.
Out of curiosity, you obviously have quite a lot of expertise when it comes to mental health and all those topics we just discussed. What's your lay of the land right now? Like, are there certain startups, certain areas that are think maybe under researched? There's certain apps or companies or startups that are really hot right now that people should pay attention to? Because when I think about mental health, I think about like a kind of mind map of like 50 different companies and like 20 different sub verticals. And it'd be good to know, like from your perspective, like what's worth like doubling down on, what's interesting.
What I don't really see happening yet is kind of like the super app for wellness.
Oh,
And
that's fascinating. Yeah.
I think there are people who are trying to maybe begin tackling that. But what I've seen a lot of is, apps that take a particular niche in mental health or wellness and try to hone in on that. And I think that can have value, but it's kind of going against the stream of everything that, the more and more that we know, the more we know that all of these things are interconnected. And having 50 different services and apps and devices tell me, how my gut bacteria are doing and how that's impacting my anxiety scores and how that might affect my heart rate, and am I jogging enough? Like, who's going to be the one to kind of crack like the holistic understanding of how that interacts? And even research wise, we barely understand these things. But I think, again, like where tech and startups can be innovative is actually starting to garner all of that data so that it's not just a service, but actually informs, what kinds of treatment or lifestyle suggestions we make for people. I think in telepsychiatry, there's a lot going on. My biggest concern is always around the experience that I had, which is of kind of the false negative, like, okay, I tried that thing, it didn't work, I'm done. And you're not necessarily going to have a telepsychiatry app say, oh, okay, it didn't work out with us, here's 50 other resources for you, and who's going to really help you kind of think about that next step. And so I look at everything that's happening and I feel like there's an opportunity, or at the very least a prerequisite for some kind of referral system, or just kind of responsibility in that landscape.
Yeah. There's one thing I've been thinking about. A lot of peer-to-peer therapy seems to be emerging, whether it's voice or written. It seems to me, and I don't have a psychology background, that that actually has risks that come with it. Because you're essentially saying someone who hasn't been trained is listening to someone's problems that may be detrimental to their own mental health as a listener, but also they could give really shoddy advice as a listener, which could actually exacerbate the problem. Is that something that a big problem that you're seeing in this space?
Yeah, I think anything that becomes uh, an echo chamber can easily become super toxic, either at scale or just person to person. And that said, I do think that technology can facilitate um, the kinds of interpersonal support around different mental health or emotional issues that are hard. I mean, especially right now, impossible to get, but sort of one degree up in sophistication from turning to your friend and saying, "Hey, I'm having this problem." And so, are there ways to have maybe clinician facilitated groups where there's a peer-to-peer component, but you've got sort of
Hmm.
someone there uh, who can bring a little bit of perspective and maybe a little bit of clinical background to it. So I think there's definitely some stuff there. Um, to that extent, like, does AI play a role in that? Like, can I just have an AI therapist? I think we're still pretty far from that. Um, but there are people who are tackling that kind of question of just
Someday.
a text therapist. Yeah, it's possible, right? There's but it all again just comes back to what I see as this like decision tree in people's kind of personal journeys with mental health, where it's like, okay, what's going to be the right approach for me in this moment? And is this going to be nimble enough to adapt to that based on my responses?
I love it. Sam, it's been awesome chatting, man. Thank you so
It was
much.
great talking to you guys.